Hey friends, Happy New Year and welcome to episode 476 of the My 123 Cents podcast. We are starting the year off with a movie mania, and I think, Chad, this is the very first time we've done, well, I guess we've done them with new releases that are streaming, but this is the first time we've both gone to the movie theater to review a movie for Movie Mania here on the podcast. So, first of all, Happy New Year and thanks for joining the conversation this week.
Well, always good to be here. Yeah, I don't think either one of us goes to the theater much anymore because with with streaming and films going to streaming so quickly most of the time, it's a better experience to watch at home. I can kind of get into that when we get talking about the movie, about the theater experience that we had. Um, well, I'll just do it right now, real quick, because it has nothing to do with the movie. But we went to a theater that you can order food at your chair, at your
Uh-huh.
seat, I guess. And because we went on Christmas Day, they didn't have as many people working, and so the couple sitting next to us had ordered food, and it was taking longer than it probably should have, I guess. And the concession worker came in three or four times to talk to them and apologize. And this is while the movie's going on. So you have someone walking in front of you, then stopping, talking to the person next to you, then walking back out. And it's just like, it's one of the things I mean, I can appreciate being able to order from your seat. I think you shouldn't do it during the movie, though. And especially
Yeah.
then also in the case where the workers come in like 30 minutes before the movie ends to settle up the tab. And it's
Oh
like,
gosh.
you're like, oh, come on. So,
Well, just based on what
mm,
you described, there were more people on the four people that you just told in that story than were in the theater that I was at. So
wow.
I live in Southern Illinois. Chad lives in Southern California. Obviously, some stark
Mm.
differences there. For the longest time, they weren't even playing it, or I guess. By the way, we're talking about the Iron Claw. If you haven't figured that out yet, by what we're talking about, and my shirt and the Carrie Von Erich poster behind me that Chad got me for Christmas, and the Texas Tornado action figure. So I'm all Von Erich up today, but they weren't playing it in Carbondale, which is the biggest kind of town here in Southern Illinois. They were playing it about an hour away, and then finally they showed that they were playing it, but not at the better movie theater. They were playing this one, and Chad, we haven't talked at all about this. So they were playing it at the mall, which is now like three stores and a bunch of medical office buildings here in Southern Illinois. So there's nothing to this mall. And I walked in around 10:30. The show was starting at 10:40, and judging by the lack of cars in the parking lot, I knew I wasn't going to worry about getting a good seat. But yeah, they said go ahead and pick your seat. The ones in whatever color are available. And I looked and there were two that were not that color. I'm like, oh my God, there's only three of us in here. So that was kind of, I didn't think it'd be a huge crowd, but I was also a little like, wow, interesting. And I'm glad that you brought up the fact that you were with someone else because I do have specific questions that maybe you can answer on her behalf. And
Yeah.
I probably should have warned you about this beforehand.
No,
But
I'm guessing the questions you have are things I was planning to say anyway.
okay,
So,
good,
but
good.
I will just say real quick too. We went to a new theater for me that I hadn't been to.
Uh-huh.
Very nice theater, by the way. And if I ever go back to the theater, I will probably pick this one to go to, unless I can go to the one that I can walk to. But I would say it had a balcony section that we were in that had probably 15 seats. And then the lower level, the 15 seats where we were, again, were the ones that you could order food, and they were the plush reclining
Oh yeah.
recliners. So that's why I chose them. I paid the extra fee to have a more enjoyable sitting experience. But I would say there were probably no more in the balcony and the lower level, no more than 10 or 15 people in the
Okay.
theater. And this was a 12:50 screening on Christmas Day. So,
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I my original plan was to go and see it on opening day, but that didn't work out. And it's funny because my wife, who is not a wrestling fan, she will occasionally, if I'm doing a show, she'll go to it, but beyond that, she's not much into it. And she had texted me because she uh, had to work the other day, and she thought I was at the mall looking for Christmas sale decorations and stuff. And she's like, "Please tell me you're not." And I said, "No, I'm at the movies watching a wrestling movie," because I hadn't told her that I was going
Mm.
because I knew she wouldn't want to go. Well, then I get home and I kind of tell her about, and she's like, "Well, I probably would have gone and seen that." And so I'm like, so probably when it streams, I may
Mm.
talk her into watching it again. But
Well, it's funny you said that because I was planning on again seeing it opening weekend myself because we had discussed,
yeah,
having this show last week, but um, and I was going to just go by myself. I had that half day on the Friday before Christmas, and I was like, okay, I can just go after work, and my girlfriend is working late. And then I said something about it, and she's like, well, I kind of want to see it. And she's not a wrestling fan either. She's gone with me to a couple AEW shows, but she
and
will
she
not
went to
watch
WrestleMania
wrestling.
'91.
And she went to WrestleMania Night One, but she will not watch wrestling with me on TV.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, I didn't think you'd want to have any interest in seeing it. And she's like, Zac Efron, Jeremy Allen White with their shirts off. Yeah, I'm like, okay, fine, but
So I guess let's start there with the
mm-hmm.
casting. Um, I'm in a Von Erich group on Facebook, and I will be sharing this podcast with that group just to see if anybody watches this or listens to it. So, uh, but I had noticed a lot of people have been very critical of the casting for a couple of reasons. But I also want to, before we get too deep into the weeds here, the very opening slide you see at the film, and we're not going to give any spoilers or anything, but it says, inspired by a true story. Now, Chad, I
Mm-hmm.
know you have talked about this on the Out of Touchdown podcast and other shows that you have done. So, kind of explain to listeners and viewers here what inspired by true events or inspired by a real life story means.
Yeah, I don't know if there is a actual definition of the difference between inspired by or based on a true
Mm-hmm.
story. To me, inspired is more um, where you take elements of a story and you give a little bit more leeway into what the story you're telling.
Yeah.
Based on is more, I think if I have this right, should be more of a factual
Mm-hmm.
element.
Yeah.
And I think as far as Iron Claw goes, the inspired by, I mean, there's so much detail in this story and so much, stuff that got left out or compressed into the story that I think they did a good job. I will say one of my biggest nits to pick with this film is the timeline, because I don't feel like we got, other than a few of the match graphics that had the date on it, we didn't tell, like, oh, this happened in 1983, and then all of a sudden we're in 1987.
Yeah.
It's like how much time has passed in between scenes.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. And again, we're not going to overly nitpick this because there were, I used to do this with you with Young Rock all the time. I'd be like, no, that's not accurate, And there were some glaring things in this movie that were like, okay, not in the timeline sequence. Probably the most glaring to me was when Kerry won the NWA heavyweight title, and then like that night they implied that he was in the wreck that he lost his foot, which it was actually 2 years after that. But and then we never saw him lose the title. Now, I will also preface this whole podcast with this. Chad knows that when we go on road trips, I have a baby bladder, and when I'm drinking soda at the movie theater, I can't make it the whole 2 hours and 23 minutes without getting up and going to the bathroom. So I did, in fact, have to get
Where
up.
it depends.
And when I came back, something, and we'll get to it as we get into the movie, but something had happened, and I'm like, did they explain this while I was in the bathroom? Because otherwise, it made no sense to me at all. But having known the Von Erich backstory, because really, I've told this story 1,000 times, and I'll probably tell it 1,000 more. It was world-class championship wrestling that officially hooked me. Now, my dad and brother had wrestling at the Chase. We grew up in St. Louis, so wrestling at the Chase was on all the time. So I saw bits and pieces of wrestling at that time, but I was not a fan. But it was that Kerry Von Erich, Ric Flair steel cage match that hooked me as a fan. And so I really obviously wanted to see this movie in theaters, not just for this podcast, but for that reasoning, because it's really what kind of brought me to the dance, so to speak. So having said all that, we were talking about casting. I think that and I don't have the list pulled up in front of me. So, to me, the casting of Fritz Von Erich for this film, and I don't have the list in front of me, but that guy was spot on. Like when he was in the ring wrestling at the very beginning, and
Mhm.
then just his mannerisms, his voice. I watched some old clips of Fritz today before we started recording, and I'm like, they really did a good job with the casting of Fritz, I thought.
Yeah, I was impressed. And real quick, I'll just say you mentioned your history with World Class.
Mhm.
I watched World Class growing up, but I think it wasn't until like 1986, 87,
Okay.
in that time frame that I discovered World Class. I remember the Dingo Warrior was probably like the biggest
Okay.
star at the time. Um, and so, yeah, for me, I know the Von Erich history. I've got the DVD that WWE put out a few years ago, and I've watched that documentary. So I know this basic story, but yeah, this was kind of going in fresh for me as
Okay.
okay, learning it. So I'll be curious to hear, the difference in again viewpoints, as we said, of the timelines and things that happen and whatnot. But to your point, yes, I thought Fritz, the actor that played Fritz, and I was going to pull it up. I know his name is. I'm not even going to attempt it because I would get it wrong. I know it starts with an H, so we'll call him H for 2 seconds. Holt McCallany or
Okay.
McClaney, and I don't know him from anything else. So this was, a clean slate basically for him. But yeah, from what I know of Fritz going into the movie, he was Fritz.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, casting wise, other than Zach Efron and the woman who played Doris, and I
Mhm.
can't remember her name off the top of my head. She's one of those faces I've seen her in things. I think she was in News Radio back in the day,
Oh
and
yeah, more
yeah.
tyranny. Yeah.
So I was aware of her and knew who she was, but I really didn't know much about the rest of the cast. So um, I think Zach Efron, obviously being the biggest name, and Kevin was kind of the thread throughout the entire
Mhm.
story, obviously, because he is the surviving brother. It made sense that they went with a bigger star. But I think when you go physique wise, I think Zach Efron looked more like how Kerry Von Erich looked in
Mhm.
his prime than Kevin. But yeah, again, the casting was great in that regard, in terms of kind of capturing the essence. I thought the guys that played David and Mike, especially, really fit the bill well. And you said his name earlier, and I can't remember it now. The guy
Jeremy
that
Allen White.
Jeremy Allen White. I've seen him do a lot of talk shows, and he's really been the main voice I've seen, at least. I'm
Mhm.
sure that Zach Efron's been on too, but every time I go on social media, I seem to see Jeremy Allen White. Um, I think that he did a pretty good job playing Kerry Von Erich. Again, one of my all-time favorites. I think maybe a bigger presence, physically might have been better in that role. But again, as fans, we can sit here and nitpick and decide, or question the decisions they made all day long. But I think probably one of the biggest criticisms was the lack of Chris Von Erich, like no mention of him at all. We've heard the stories. There were six sons, five of them tragically died way early in their livelihood. And we do get the story of Jack in the movie, but Chris isn't even mentioned or brought up. And I know that has been a sore spot for many fans, as far as the diehard Von Erich fans. But I understand it. At 2 hours and 23 minutes, I thought this was a long film. Even covering 40 years, a 40-year timeline of life events and wrestling, and trying to keep that story going. And so, you know, I don't know why he was omitted, but he was, and I think that the Von Erich family gave their blessing to the film once it was done, and Kevin was at the screenings and has talked about it, and the sons have talked about it. So I think if they're okay with it, the fans should be okay with it
Yeah,
too.
okay. Yeah, and that's one of the things where if I hadn't read anything and if we weren't having this conversation, I wouldn't even have remembered Chris
Hmm.
Von Erich because, and again, I haven't looked up his timeline of where he would have fit into the story or what, but I think part of it is, like you said, there's only so much time you have, but also given what the story is, would Chris's story have not mattered, but would have been too much? Would
Right.
it have just been because my girlfriend and I were talking about this afterwards, and I said, if you wrote a fictional story and made it what Iron Claw is.
Yeah.
Nobody would believe it
Right.
because it's just too much of, well, tragedy, let's
Yeah.
say. I think anybody listening to this probably knows the basics of the Von Erich story, but um, yeah, it was just, I think so. If you would have added Chris, I think it would have just been like maybe too much, maybe taking the audience out and that. So, and and I've read an interview with the director who said that he kind of combined Mike and Chris into one character.
Yeah. I saw that too. And, again, I think that they did a good job of capturing that essence of that time period, of that time frame. Seeing the other wrestlers that they brought in, the Freebirds and
Mm.
Bruiser Brody and Gino Hernandez, I thought those were all casted well. And I know there's been some discussion on Twitter I saw, of the choice for Ric Flair. And I didn't really think much about it at the time, and I guess you pointed out he said "whoa" instead of "woo." I didn't even catch that.
Yeah, Ric Flair, he's the one, like you mentioned Young Rock before, and we've talked about the casting on that. This Ric Flair is such a personality in the
Yeah,
world of wrestling, and to cast a guy who couldn't even, in my opinion, do a good Ric Flair impersonation. Like, I had a little Twitter conversation with one of our friends, and I'm like, I would have believed Jay Lethal as Ric Flair
yeah,
more than the guy that they got
yeah,
as Ric Flair. And part of that, I don't know if it's due to a likeness issue, a copyright issue, which is why I think he may have said "whoa" instead of "woo," because
hmm
I believe Flair has "woo" trademarked.
he does. Yes,
And so, and those are the types of things, as fans, that we don't know all the ins and outs and the legal wranglings. So, I mean, did it destroy the whole movie because of that one 60-second clip that Ric Flair's in? No. It's just, as someone though who is a big Ric Flair fan, who has seen Flair, who has seen numerous impersonations, to see one that poorly done,
yeah,
it's just kind of like, oh, come on. But yeah, I mean, I thought everything else. Bruiser Brody, we can say again, he didn't look as tall as what Bruiser Brody looked like, and I don't really know Gino Hernandez that well, and I didn't even catch who the actor was. I don't know if you noticed him, but it
no.
was Dolph Ziggler's brother,
Oh, was it?
Ryan Nemeth. Yeah.
I didn't know. No, I didn't know that. I liked the fact that they used one that they brought in Chavo Guerrero, who I believe also did a lot of the uh, training
Glow.
for Glow,
Glow.
yeah, but I think he also worked on Young Rock as well
Yeah.
and helping train the actors to get in there
Mhm.
and do their thing. I noticed that there were a couple of clips, the Kerry Von Erich Ric Flair world title match, and there was one other match, and I don't remember which one it was.
The
Oh, it was
SummerSlam.
SummerSlam, yeah, where they used the actual
Mhm.
footage from it as you're watching it on the TV.
Mhm.
And I did appreciate that they did that, and I'm sure they had to do something with
Right.
WWE to work out that deal. But uh, I thought that the action with the actors in the ring
Mhm.
wrestling was believable. Will we see them do a crossover? I know we saw the Von Erichs, Marshall and Ross show up on AEW with Kevin
Mhm.
and do some stuff. I was kind of surprised WWE didn't get more involved with it, but I know that they didn't have their fingerprints on it, so
Mhm.
maybe that's why they opted not to. And Tony
Yeah.
Khan saw an opportunity.
I wonder if it's because WWE didn't have any financial, whereas AEW has the connection with Maxwell Jacob Friedman, who
Mhm.
is in a blink and you'll miss him scene in the movie. And he was also one of the executive producers for the film. So that may have helped. Also, AEW was in Texas at the time that the movie came out. So it was great. And I wonder if WWE also, because of the subject matter and the overall story, maybe they just didn't want to kind of bring up that aspect of wrestling.
Mhm.
So I will say, um, talking about the Von Erichs being on AEW, Kevin was with them, and after he came out, I'd message you, and I'm like, oh, Kevin still got the promo skills, I see, and I was being snarky because
Yeah.
his promo was really bad, and then I had to laugh at myself. when watching the movie when Kevin's lack of promo ability is actually a couple of scenes in the movie, and
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, did I? Is that something that people associate with Kevin not being a good talker? But yeah, so I got a personal enjoyment out of that aspect.
Yeah, that was I did laugh when because it's the scene with him and Bill Mercer, the announcer,
Mm-hmm.
and he keeps stopping and starting over, and David's there, and I do think I my fandom I saw David plenty of times, but not enough to like resonate or really remember what he was like. But I do think that he was kind of he was the chosen one. He was going to be the NWA heavyweight champion. I think he was
Mm-hmm.
going to beat Ric Flair. Um, and then, of course, he tragically dies just a few months before that show was set to happen. So I do think he had kind of that it factor with the promos and the wrestling ability. Uh, and you mentioned MJF, and that's what I was going to ask you about. So that's when I was in the bathroom. When I came
Yeah.
back, Lance Von Erich was in the ring with Kevin, but they never said his name. And again, I walked in, so they
Mm.
never said his name or any. Did they set that scene up in any way, or was it just showing that match?
It was just showing that. I'm trying to think of what had happened previous because it was just showing Kevin kind of not really being into the wrestling at that moment.
Yeah, and it was after Kerry's accident.
Yeah. And so I think, yeah, but there's no mention of who he was
Okay.
teaming with or what. And it was just that one scene, basically, that one match where he's on the outside of the
Okay.
ropes looking bored and, you know, um, yeah.
If I
It's
had,
funny though. It's funny though, because my girlfriend got up and went to the bathroom as well. And she walked out when the motorcycle accident happened
oh, okay,
and didn't come back until after he'd gotten out of bed and walked to the kitchen and, you see the aftermath. But I was like, and I had filled her in on that part of the story before we went in, so it
oh, okay,
wasn't like she missed something big. But yeah, like you said, they never really mention. It's played up. It's kind of shows what Carrie went through afterwards, but they don't talk about it.
yeah. Well, had I not known that MJF was in the movie
Mm-hmm.
playing Lance Von Erich, I would have. That scene to me would have been like confusing. I
Mm-hmm.
think
And
because
I'm curious when the movie comes out on DVD or Blu-ray if they add the deleted scenes because
yeah.
apparently MJF did shoot scenes as Lance, but
Oh, okay.
we'll
Yeah,
see.
it might make more sense in that regard. I think it's always difficult though for Hollywood to put together a film, biopic or biopic, because people are going to nitpick and say, well, this person didn't do that, or they didn't look like this, or they were taller,
Mm.
or they were shorter, or they were heavier, or whatever the case. Like kind of, we did a little bit of that, but obviously through a less critical eye, I think, and just kind of making some observational comments on it. To me, none of it took away from the film. It did not take away
Mm-hmm.
from my enjoyment of the movie, and seeing it in that regard. Uh, Overall, what was your impression of that? Like do you typically go to these or watch these types of films? Did you watch the movie Bohemian Rhapsody and
Mm-hmm.
Rocket Man and those types of films? And how does this hold up to something like that?
Yeah, I do. And again, it's, how much of the story going in versus
Hmm.
how much. I mean, I think for me, the biggest one recently has been The Greatest Showman, the
Oh,
Hugh Jackman movie about P.T. Barnum, where
yeah.
it shows P.T. Barnum be this awesome guy who's, all these things. And then you read the history and he's like, no, P.T. Barnum was a jerk who hated the freaks in his freak show and didn't associate with them and was horrible to his wife. And it's like, okay, so you just kind of whitewashed his whole story
Yeah.
to make a good Zac Efron musical. I gotcha. Um, but this one, the only thing I guess can kind of take away from, and it's a conversation that I had with my girlfriend afterwards because she has kind of read into the backstory and they downplayed a lot of the drug use.
Mhm.
I mean, you see Carrie, with the pills and steroids a little bit, but like Mike Von Erich, I guess, uh, had gotten a DUI shortly before um, things happen, and none of that is really played out. Like her takeaway was that it was basically just these boys trying to please their father, and the father being over demanding, and basically saying like, my rankings are David, Kevin, Carrie, Mike, and any
Yeah.
one of those can change at any time depending on what you do. And as long as you're the best, then I'll appreciate you.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do think there was some of that, again, given the time frame that it happened, and given what little I know about Fritz von Erich's personality. I can see that, but she was just upset, not upset, but just kind of like, okay, they kind of made them a little bit. I don't know what the correct phrasing would be, not nicer, but they didn't go all the way into the demon aspect, let's say.
Hmm. Yeah, and having known obviously how the story is going to go, did she know the tragedy that was, like, did she kind of know what she was getting into going in and seeing this?
No, no. And so that's what I liked actually watching the movie next to her, was whenever something happened, she would like audibly gasp or just be like, oh my God, or, all this stuff. And when she's joked afterwards, she's like, that is the most depressing film I've ever seen. Thank you for, depressing me. I cannot watch any wrestling anymore because it is. But and I think that's the sign of a good film, and a film that drew her into the characters and made her care about them, so that when something does happen, you have that visceral feeling of sadness or
Hmm.
shock.
Yeah, I liked how they, and again, we're not going to give any spoilers, but some of the sequencing with toward the end where we know what happens with Carrie, and
Mm-hmm.
how they kind of handled that. I did like that, and kind of with Kevin's family, he and
Mm-hmm.
Pam get married and have kids, and in the movie it's two sons, and eventually they do have two sons, but I think he had uh,
It's
I
got
know
two more.
yeah, I know his daughter is the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
He's got two daughters and two sons, and I don't know where the other daughter falls into the family lineage, but
Yeah.
um,
I
and
guess
oh yeah, go ahead.
okay. Just gonna say, I guess that's the thing too with like Carrie, knowing that Carrie has Lacey
Hmm.
as the daughter, and that's never mentioned. And like, I don't know if he was ever married or what, which isn't really addressed in the movie either. But yeah, I think again, time frame, storytelling, and I don't know if they just focus on the two boys of Kevin's because they are the
Yeah,
current generation wrestling Von Erichs.
that was kind
Or if it was just
of
showing the father and boy and son relationship, which was a theme throughout the film.
yeah, and that's where I was going earlier with Carrie, because he was married and had um, two daughters as well. Lacey being one of them that we, as wrestling fans probably know. But they kind of portrayed him as kind of a playboy and was with some random woman at
Mm-hmm.
Christmas after he won the Intercontinental title. So yeah, I again, those little nitpick scenes that you
Mm-hmm.
could do, but again, it to me it didn't take away from the overall presentation, the overall story of it. Um, I'm trying to think if there has been, and correct me if I'm wrong, this feels like it's the first time we've had a wrestling biopic uh, on the big screen. And I think that there's probably been some smaller films, and I know this was an
Yeah.
independent film, but someone like Zac Efron, lending his credibility to
Mm-hmm.
it, and I can't think of another instance where this has happened. Can you?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I know, I mean, just a few months ago, we got Cassandro. I think that's the name of it, which is the biopic of the Lucha Libre star, which I think that just went straight to Amazon streaming,
Okay.
which is also supposed to be a really good film. I tried watching it. I got about halfway through. And again, maybe it's because it's a wrestler I'm not that familiar with. And a guy that I thought was wrestled like in the 70s and found out that he's currently wrestling.
Oh
So
wow.
a bit off on my history of Cassandro, but yeah, I just didn't find that one as engaging. But and I'm trying to think of other wrestling biopics. And the only one that I can come up with is Foxcatcher, which is about Olympic wrestling.
Yeah,
And I guess that's one of the points of the movie that I didn't realize, that Kerry was supposed to compete in the 1980 Olympics,
yeah.
and then
That
Jimmy Carter
I do
screwed him out of
remember
that.
reading that. Yeah, and then they did use the real footage of Jimmy Carter announcing that the United States would not be
Yeah.
participating, and it really did make me think too when they did that, when they replayed that, how, because he was young at that time. He was
Mm-hmm.
barely 20 years old, and so I wonder, had he gone and won the gold, how that would have played out
Mm-hmm.
as a wrestler. Because really, we knew Ken Patera competed in the Olympics, the Iron Sheik competed in the Olympics, and they kind of played off that. But then Kurt Angle, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and Mark Henry getting more of that accolade. Would Kerry have been a bigger star had he had that Olympic medal or
Mm-hmm.
even that Olympic status behind him? I don't know. It would be interesting to see how that would have played out had he been able to go and participate. Because I do think uh, he either still holds or for a long time held the record at
Mm-hmm.
his high school, and I believe maybe at the university he was attending. But I do know that he was a pretty good athlete beyond just what he did in the ring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder because, granted, after an Olympic appearance, I don't think there's really like a professional discus circuit that you can
Right.
go into. But I wonder if that would have led to other opportunities, and then maybe he doesn't go into wrestling,
Yeah.
or he gets into wrestling later, and that curtails some of the things that he went through that led to, you know, things in his life. So,
Yeah, we can, dime store psychology. To me, it's also a reminder, though, that, um, these larger than life heroes, and I've, mentioned it here earlier. Kerry Von Erich is one of my all time favorites. And knowing that he was, when I was a kid, I didn't know that he was, addicted to painkillers or to
mm,
alcohol or prescription drugs or whatever it was that he was addicted to. You just see that performer in the ring, and then you learn more about their life. And as an adult, you view things. I think you can view those types of situations in one of two ways. One, where you are judging that person's choices and decisions, and the other one, being a little empathetic and understanding that mental, the mental workings of someone who
mm-hmm.
is addicted or is bipolar or whatever the mental illness may be. And I think that unfortunately, with most of the sons, they were caught in some sort of mental illness along
Mm-hmm.
with or the addiction and the need to constantly please their father. And they
Mm-hmm.
kind of, Doris, I don't know how she was in real life, but she's kind of portrayed as a not maybe the most loving and caring and nurturing mom that
Mm-hmm.
you might come to expect. And so there were other elements going on there that kind of explain some of the choices maybe that they made. And I know that Kevin has said in interviews that I think it might have been on Dark Side of the Ring actually, that him being involved with Pam so early on in his life, in his adulthood, maybe what saved him, because he wasn't a party animal. He was that dad and that husband and that family man, whereas the other brothers were doing kind of their own thing. So, um, and that's a testament to Pam and their relationship after being married for more than 40 years. Well, I'm not going to say any more than that, but
Mm-hmm.
knowing
Yeah.
what we know about the family and the dynamic is, to me, a testament and good on him and Ross and Marshall for wrestling as well.
Yeah, there's just so much, that goes on in a person's life that, it's the whole butterfly flapping its wings changes one aspect, and
Mhm.
so if you change one thing, how does that affect the whole outcome? And yeah, I definitely think that the pressure to live up to Fritz's expectations, where I think that would have a hard time on any any one person, but then you factor in the pain from wrestling,
Yeah,
and how many, I mean, not even just the Von Erichs, but how many wrestlers have said, like, especially in the 80s when they're doing 250, 300 shows a year,
yeah,
it's going to take its toll. And it's a lot harder at that time than it is now because of conditioning and training and whatnot. So yeah, it's again, I was going to ask, I wondered why Kevin turned out the way, his life went the way, but like you said, he was with Pam from an early age, and if hopefully she was a good guiding focus or something to focus on other than the wrestling aspect.
yeah, absolutely. And um, you know, I wonder as we were trying to think of other wrestling stories that have been told in this way, because obviously there are tons of documentaries out there. We've seen
Mm-hmm.
WWE does a great job producing those documentaries, and then we've seen other independent filmmakers doing the Iron Sheik one and the Jake the Snake Roberts story.
Yeah.
We've seen some of those stories as documentaries, but is there a story out there in wrestling that you think would be a good big screen, where I think that so far Iron Claw has had moderate success. I don't think it wasn't at the top of the box office, but I think that it did, from what I read, it did okay, from
Mm-hmm.
what the pundits and the critics were expecting it to
Yeah.
do, money wise. Can a wrestling story get some real Hollywood backing and get beyond that independent filmmaker stage? Do you think?
Oh, I definitely think so. And I think, in the world of wrestling, the Von Erich name obviously is high on the list.
Yeah.
But to the casual fan or a non wrestling fan, do they know what what the Von Erichs
Mhm.
are or who they
Mhm.
were? And and I think, given that it's been almost 40 years since World Class shut down, that the Von Erich name doesn't have wide recognition. It doesn't have a high Q rating, as they like to say. So the fact that this movie did do as well as it has done, and it's gotten, the critical reception has been terrific for the film. I know a lot of people were surprised when Zac Efron didn't get nominated for a Golden Globe, and not going to hold out hopes that there's a Oscar nomination because while I think Zach did a good job, I don't think it's a award-winning performance.
Mhm.
But that doesn't take away from the film either.
Right.
The film is good. I think, obviously, let's say, instead of doing Young Rock the TV show, they make the Dwayne Johnson story. I
Yeah.
think that would be huge. Or, I'm thinking, if they did a Hulk Hogan or a Ric Flair story, would they do well? And I think again, it comes down to the casting and the story itself and how well it's told. Because the wrestler, the Mickey Rourke film, did well, but that also showed wrestling in a more serious light. I mean, at, up to now, that was probably the best wrestling movie made, and
Yeah.
because it took the subject serious, and
Right.
it wasn't a body slam or no holds bar, where it's
Yeah.
goofy. It's
Yeah.
like, no, let's show the the human aspect of the business.
That's an excellent point.
So, yeah, I was going to ask you, who do you think, if someone else is out there, some other screenwriter, independent director, wants to do a wrestling biopic, who would you like to see?
I would like to see Andre the Giant's story told, and I feel like years and years ago, Billy Crystal had flirted with the idea of being a part of it,
Mm.
producer or writer or director. Well, I
I
don't
mean,
know what
he
role.
did a movie called My Giant, which I've never seen, but I think that's loosely based.
Okay, okay, and maybe that's what it was. But I always found Andre to be fascinating, and I think enough people, you know, even Gen X or our age, who maybe didn't necessarily know much about him in the ring wrestling, remember him from the Honeycomb commercial, or they remember him from Princess Bride. So I think that could do well. In the more modern day era, I mean, I would love to see a Vince
Mm.
McMahon story. Uh,
Which there was supposed to be, but at
yeah.
Netflix, but that just recently got canceled.
Did it get canceled? Okay.
Yeah.
So, And supposedly at one point, one of the Hemsworth brothers was going to play Hulk Hogan in some
Again.
kind of film. I don't know what the situation is with that. If that's
Yeah, I think that's been scrapped as
has it been
well.
scrapped
And
too.
yeah.
So I wonder, will this, obviously when things don't go well, people are like use that as an excuse not to do something. But
Mhm.
this is, the Iron Claw has had some moderate success again. I've seen it talked up on Entertainment Tonight and those kinds of things, if
Mhm.
that matters for anything.
Mhm.
But I wonder if it gets a little, because I was surprised when I heard that they were making the film. I was surprised to hear one
Mhm.
that it was going to be a theatrical release, and during the holiday season, which is typically a time where they kind of release some of the bigger films. I guess I don't know if that's still a thing or not, but
Well, they
um,
just released Aquaman
yeah.
too, so obviously.
So I was happy to hear that and surprised to hear that, and like you said, it doesn't make wrestling. It doesn't make fun of wrestling. It doesn't make and even though this was a very touchy and maybe emotional subject for some fans, it didn't, um,
It didn't
minimize.
exploit it.
It didn't exploit it, and it didn't minimize the business,
Mhm.
or the whole, like you said, no holds barred or body slam
Mhm.
or those types of films. So,
Yeah.
I hold out hope that others will get this kind of treatment, and maybe it inspires other filmmakers that are wrestling fans to do something like that. Because I do think you have to be a fan of the business to at least have an unbiased. Maybe you do have a biased view in some regards, but you'd be less likely to make it a hokey or exploitive film. I think.
Yeah. True. I mean, I was joking with my girlfriend on the way after we left the movie that I would like to see a Ric Flair biopic, although I said that might need to be a mini series, and it would lead to about 2,700 more Me Too movements coming out.
Yeah,
But
that is true.
and that's the other thing is, you mentioned the movie Rocket Man
Uh-huh.
several minutes ago, and I remember reading when that came out, like they had been trying to do a Elton John biopic for many years, and one of the things Elton John said was like, it can't be PG-13. I did not leave a PG-13 life. I want it
Yeah,
to be authentic, and
yeah,
so so in the case of Ric Flair, if you make an authentic film, is that a good thing? In the case of Hulk Hogan, where do you separate the line between fact and fiction?
right.
And are they going to include the scene where he auditions for Metallica? I don't know, but yeah. So I think and I think maybe taking a lesser known or some person, and I'm drawing a blank on names at the moment who would make a good cause, but someone who isn't Hogan, Flair, The Rock, Steve
Yeah,
Austin, who these guys who have awareness outside of the wrestling ring, you might be able to do a better story because you can make a more human story, maybe.
yeah. Let me ask you this because we've talked about this before. I don't think necessarily on a show, maybe on a movie mania, but 2 hours and 20-ish minutes for the Iron Claw. Too long, long enough, not long enough, or just right, do you think?
Well, I have a growing annoyance with films these days that everything is 2 hours or
Yeah,
more, and there definitely does not need to be that way.
yeah,
Um, I think, especially being at the theater, because I think there was like 25 minutes of trailers, none
yeah,
of which made me eager to rush back to the theater to see another movie.
yeah,
Um, so that plays into it as well. If I had been sitting at home watching a 2 hour and 15-minute movie, I I thought it felt fine for this film. I didn't
yeah,
feel like it really dragged. I wasn't checking my watch to be like, oh, how much time's left, or
right,
you
yeah,
know. I think that's a good sign. So I would say probably for this one, yeah, it fit well. Because if you cut out time, I mean, I'm sure there are places where you could cut bits and parts out and shorten it, but nothing that's really going to. Again, you could cut out the Lance Von Erich scene entirely and save yourself a minute 30,
yeah,
but um, yeah, and again, and I don't think they needed to stretch the story out any longer than it did because, again, given the subject matter, given the heaviness of the film,
yeah.
if you were there for 3 hours, I think that would have been a little too soul crushing.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. I'm in the same camp. I'm like in a 90 to
That,
100,
yeah.
maybe 115-minute long movie, but this worked. I felt it was fine. It flowed, and it didn't get. There weren't scenes where I felt like it was dragging on too long. It kept a nice pace and a nice cadence
Mhm.
throughout the whole film. So
Yeah.
obviously, I think we both found this to be favorable. I don't remember. It's been so long since we've done a movie Mania. What our rating system was.
I think it was like main event,
Oh yeah,
intermission, curtain,
yeah.
Joker.
So I'm
Um,
going main event on this. Obviously, a Von Erich fan, so I'm partly
mhm.
biased in that. But again, I thought because, like I said, I've seen people who have been critical of the casting choices before they've even gone to see the film. So take yourself away from that. Lower your expectations, maybe if you feel like you know you live and breathe and die by the casting choices and go in there and just watch it objectively. And I think that you will be entertained. And you mean like Chad, and there were some elements of their lives that I didn't know about that I learned about as well. So you'll learn a thing or two as well going into this.
Yeah, and real quick, I'll just say because we hadn't really we mentioned him, but not really talked about his performance. I thought Jeremy Allen White
Hmm.
was a good Carrie, and
Yeah,
yes, he's maybe a foot shorter than Carrie, and I'll leave the missing foot joke alone. But I didn't care. It wasn't the height wasn't a element of the story that needed to be there. I thought his performance was good, and knowing him from The Bear and from Shameless, I mean, yes, I can tell it's Jeremy Allen White looking at him, seeing the acting is very similar, but I thought he brought life to that character and made Carrie his own, which is the other aspect when you're making, a biopic is do you want someone who's going to capture the person down to the T? I mean, we complain about Ric Flair in the
yeah,
film, but did it have to be the Ric Flair, or do you want someone who embodies the body of the person and the soul and makes them, the character? Because I wouldn't say that Zach Efron looked like Kevin Von Erich, other
sure.
than the really bad wig he was wearing. But the character itself is fine. And I don't know, I couldn't pick David or Mike out of a lineup if you showed me, but I thought those actors played those characters really well as well.
Yeah,
So, yeah, I think the acting all around. I would like to see this at least get a when the Screen Actors Guild comes around, get a nomination for best ensemble cast
yeah,
because I think everyone did. Again, other than Ric Flair, there's no bad acting in this film. It was really well done. Um, yeah, I would say this is a film that I would probably recommend going out and seeing it in the theater just for that experience. Or definitely when it comes on, it's an A24 production. I think they just signed a deal with HBO, so it will be streaming
oh,
on Max eventually, most likely. But yeah, I think this movie did shock me in how good it was and how well it told the story.
couldn't have said it better myself. I agree. I think the six principal, the Von Erichs, the six with Fritz and Doris and the four sons, they hit the nail on the head with him. Again, I didn't know much about Doris, but uh, the four sons and Fritz were perfectly portrayed. I thought the woman who played Pam did a good job. And again, without knowing anything about her, just seeing pictures and whatnot. And I did go and creep and look at their the oldest daughter's Instagram page, and she's got family pictures at the premiere and stuff. So I feel like the family's happy with it. Most of the fans seem to be happy with it, other than a few casting choices or maybe some lack in continuity or whatever you want to call it. But again, definitely recommend seeing this and going and seeing it in the theaters because we as fans, if we want more films like this, we have to not just talk about them, but we have to go out there and support them and show that support with our dollars. So I'm all in favor of it, and maybe WWE films revives and comes back and does something as well. I don't know. Maybe we get the Baron Corbin story next.
Awesome.
Chad,
Can't wait for the
anything else
whole.
you want to say? What that?
Oh, I was just gonna say I can't wait for that whole hour-long stretch of happy Corbin and sad Corbin. Ah. Um, no, I was just gonna say, this is a good way to start off the year. So hopefully 2024 will be a good one. And um, yeah, that's all I got.
All right. Well, friends, Happy New Year. We hope that you have a great 2024 and stay tuned for more announcements on the My 123 Cents social media. Thanks for listening and or watching to this week's show. Have a great week and we will talk again soon.